No, what I'm saying is when you hire our people, we always look out for everybody else. We are the most generous people on the planet.
Late today, the U.S. Justice Department launched an investigation into the city of Chicago and its hiring practices.
It centers on whether discrimination is at play inside City Hall, given the large number of, quote, black officials the DOJ says have been hired by the Johnson administration.
Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson is in a lot of trouble. Recently, he did an interview where he talked about how his office was going out of their way to disproportionately hire black people for all these different various positions, and the way that he described the logic and reasoning behind their decision to hire black people disproportionately was so absurd, so ridiculous, and so obviously sounding like it's violative of the Civil Rights Act that has also triggered a Department of Justice investigation into his office. Not for the political appointees, which, by the way, because they're inherently political, can basically be done for almost any reason, but due to the fact that there is probably and likely downstream racial discrimination through his mayor's office. And by the way, none of us should be surprised by that. But of course, what I want to do throughout the course of this video is look at Brandon Johnson's stated reasoning about how black people are so generous to each and every group. They're known for being the most generous people in the United States of America, that therefore putting them in all these different various positions will solve all of society's problems because black people are just better than any other kind of people when it comes to government offices. And then I'm going to talk about the real reason why Brandon Johnson is going out of his way to make sure he installs as many black people in the Chicago government as humanly possible, because I think those rationales, what he stated and what the reality is, are completely different. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
Mayor's comments yesterday prompting a barrage of social media posts calling for an investigation. And today, we heard from the Department of Justice.
The U.S. Department of Justice opening up a civil rights investigation into the city of Chicago, the DOJ specifically looking into the city's hiring practices. This comes after remarks Mayor Brandon Johnson made at the Apostolic Church of God in Woodlawn yesterday, where Mayor Johnson shared his vision for the rest of his term, emphasizing education, public safety, and equity. Johnson also saying his administration is one of the most diverse in the city's history.
So as you saw right there, Brandon Johnson is making the case that the reason why he's staffing up all these different various departments is because black people happen to be the most generous population in the United States of America, and unlike all these other groups who care more about themselves and more about their group, black people tend to care about each and every type of person in the United States of America, and that's just because they're so morally better inherently than all these other groups, especially white people. White people are obviously racist, they're evil, white, and racist, and black people are the perfect group in order to allocate resources the best way possible in order to show the generosity of the United States of America. Now, let us just be clear about something from the top. This is so absurdly and obviously not true, so ridiculous and absurd from top to bottom that it should not even need to be explained, but I'm going to explain it anyway using facts, figures, and numbers because, again, Brandon Johnson lives in unreality and we gotta park this conversation in actual reality. However, I will give the caveat that throughout the course of this video, I'm going to talk in generalities, I'm going to bring up certain stereotypes, and the point of me bringing this stuff up is not to enforce negative stereotypes, it's just to talk about how generalities do exist, and stereotypes are often rooted in said generalities. But again, let us get the pitch from Brandon Johnson so we could just internalize what he's trying to say.
There are some detractors that will push back on me and say, the only thing the mayor talks about is the hiring of black people. No, what I'm saying is when you hire our people, we always look out for everybody else. We are the most generous people on the planet.
Okay, so I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that one of the most generous groups of people in the United States of America is not, in fact, black Americans. In fact, if you were to ask people who they've met as a group and who has been the most generous to them, I think a huge portion of Americans, specifically on the left coast of this country, would say the Mormons. Now, of course, this is not an endorsement of their religious beliefs or anything of the sort, but the Mormons are so stereotypically generous, kind, and family oriented that even in the South Park episode that makes fun of Mormons, makes fun of their Mormon beliefs, they give them credit where credit is due. And by the way, this carries through into the musical that Matt Stone and Trey Parker made called The Book of Mormon, because this is so obvious and out there in the culture that these people happen to be generous. And of course, this is backed up by the numbers. They send food all over the world. They do all this different charity work. Again, whatever you think of these people's religious beliefs, there is a reason why we have the stereotype in our brains that these people are family oriented and generous. And that's not to say that there aren't negative stereotypes associated with Mormons, but at least on this is pretty clear. Also, I do need to point out that people in the Midwest in general are also some of the kindest, most generous people that you'll ever meet. I have spent time doing different events in the Midwest, and these are the kind of people that if you're having trouble deciding something at a restaurant, they will start talking to you, ask you where you're from, ask you how your family's doing, and all of that, and give you valuable suggestions, because that is just the culture that happens to exist in certain parts of this country with certain groups in this nation. Now, typically, and I'm just saying, this is not all, there are definitely generous black people out there. Black people do not have a kind of stereotype around them about their generosity. Typically, black people, and you can ask people in the food service industry, are known for being the opposite. And again, this could be rooted in a bunch of different various things. Black people tend to say that they get worse service when they go to restaurants. But if you were to ask people who work as staff in restaurants, specifically servers at restaurants, they will tell you that black people have a reputation for not tipping, and this is just one marker of generosity that we're talking about. Now again, some people will say it's a chicken or the egg kind of situation. Black people will say that they get worse service at restaurants. Servers will say that because they are so often not tipped by black guests, that they don't offer their A+ efforts, or black people come in with an attitude, so no amount of service is good enough for them, or something of the sort. The truth of the matter doesn't really matter. It's just the reality is that these people are not typically viewed as being the most generous, at least in that specific context. And in addition to that, Brandon Johnson also makes the case that black people care about each and every group more than members of any other group, which I just find to be absurd based on the polling, based on the numbers. We have seen time and time again that black Americans tend to have the strongest in-group preference among groups in the United States of America, and the strongest amount of disdain for people outside of their group. Again, Brandon Johnson just putting out these ideas which are not backed up by reality, and in reality, the opposite seems to be proven to be true. Now, I also want to point out for everybody out there in the audience that a strong in-group preference is not inherently a bad thing. Typically, when you combine strong in-group preference with high social trust, what you end up with is a very successful minority group. We hear this all the time about Jewish people, but it's true of Koreans, it's true of Armenians, it's true of Lebanese individuals, and a bunch of other members of a bunch of other groups in the United States of America have found great success in this country with strong in-group preference and, of course, high social trust. But the thing is about black America is they tend to have lower social trust than those other groups, and honestly, I think one of the problems that they should work on solving among themselves is increasing their level of social trust, because I believe that will lead to success. But the fact is, black people are not known for caring about other peoples. That's just not true.
The deputy mayor is a black woman. Department of Planning and Development is a black woman. Infrastructure deputy mayor is a black woman. Chief operations officer is a black man. Budget director is a black woman. Senior advisor is a black man. And I'm laying that out because when you ask how do we ensure that our people get a chance to grow their business, having people in my administration that will look out for the interest of everyone, and everyone means you have to look out for the interests of black folks.
The Justice Department citing that exact moment in this letter to Mayor Johnson today, saying if these kind of hiring decisions are being made for top-level positions in your administration, then it begs the question whether such decisions are also being made for lower-level positions.
Now look, again, this is a generality. Now look, again, this is a stereotype. Now look, again, I am not saying this is applicable to all people, but if you are going to talk about a group of individuals that despises, let's say, white women more than any other group in this entire country, would the answer to that question not be black women? Brandon Johnson is talking about how I have a black woman here, a black woman there, and they're the most generous of all the different groups in the United States of America, when in reality, we know that in general, black women tend to not be fans of white women, specifically white women that happen to be dating or interested in dating black men. This is a very common thing that is portrayed in the media. We see movie after movie, especially since we've seen the era of black cinema come back a little bit in the United States of America, where white women are often painted as the villain because they're white, especially the white women that want to date black men. And this is just borne out by the numbers, by the strong in-group preference, and by the fact that, of course, we see each and every day whenever there's a story involving a white woman getting into an altercation with a black person, that white woman gets labeled the slur of Karen, or all these other things get attributed to her, and it's just ridiculous and absurd. And by the way, one of the biggest manifestations of this was the O.J. Simpson trial, the O.J. Simpson verdict that resulted from that trial, which of course had a bunch of different black women that were put on the jury. The prosecution believed that they would side with the woman because of the abuse and whatnot, and in reality, what ultimately ended up happening was that the black women sided against the white woman because they didn't like her, they despised her, and they thought it was more important to get revenge for black people, for Rodney King, than actually put a double murderer away, because after all, he only murdered a white man and a white woman, and who really cares about that? And again, if you don't believe me, I will play this clip until the end of this channel. You can hear it from these people themselves.
Do you think that they're members of the jury that voted to acquit OJ because of Rodney King?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
How many of you think felt that way?
Oh, probably 90% of us.
90%? Did you feel that way?
Yes.
That was payback.
Uh-huh.
You think that's right?
Now again, the point of this particular video is not to attack black people or black women or any other group based on some things that are generally true, because I've been fortunate enough in my life to meet some of the more kind black women or interact with them, and I'm sure if you go out there in the real world, the people who exhibit these negative stereotypes, you will find that there are fewer of them than you actually believe if you don't actually interact with them. That being said, again, there are numbers, there is polling on in-group preference, there are stereotypes, there are actions that manifest, and we see representation after representation of that in the media over and over again. And a perfect example of something that is happening in the modern era is the Carmelo Anthony Austin Metcalf situation. A lot of black people know that Carmelo Anthony is in fact guilty of murder. Now, some of them, to be clear, have been fooled by all the disinformation that's out there, all the fake Facebook posts and all of that, but the fact is, this kid was able to raise over $500,000 for his legal defense fund, and all you needed to do was look at the comments to realize that the reason he's raising this money is due to a racial solidarity, which is solely based on the fact that Carmelo Anthony killed a white person. Another example of this is the guy who killed the cop that we talked about on this channel, Rodney Hinton Jr. There's a lot of people praising him for murdering a cop, and this was a day after the justified shooting of his son, who was in a stolen car, who had a firearm on him. By the way, it's caught on body cam, and even though he murdered a random different department retired sheriff's deputy by running him down that had nothing to do with his son's case, you have all these different posts on social media praising him and people pushing to raise money for his legal defense, even though what he did is clearly and obviously unjustified homicide. Again, these are negative representations of the in-group preference that black people tend to have.
Says the DOJ assumption that since Johnson's senior staff is mostly black, that there's discrimination at play is a leap.
It's an enormous leap to say that because Brandon Johnson's top deputies in policymaking positions are African American, that the city is discriminating on the basis of race in its hiring of ordinary non-policymaking employees.
Our people hire our people.
Now look, I think I've made my case that black people do not actually, according to the numbers, care about other groups outside of black people more than any other group. I think I've made my case that black people are not traditionally known for being the most generous of the groups of people in the United States of America, but I do want to get into the real reason why Brandon Johnson is going out of his his way to pander to black people over and over again, because a lot of people want to pin this down to the fact that Brandon Johnson is a racist. He is anti-white, which is 100% true, by the way. And Brandon Johnson does actively despise white people and play the race card each and every day. But in reality, the real reason he's trying to pander to blacks so much is that that's who put him into office. You see, unlike many of these other elections that we talk about where the black population tends to vote different than the upper middle class white progressives in that they vote for tough on crime because they're actually impacted by the criminality in their own neighborhood, Brandon Johnson ran a very racialized campaign in the Democratic Party, essentially accusing his opponent of being an evil white racist all the time, and black people in the highest crime neighborhoods ended up responding in a moment of racial solidarity with Brandon Johnson and put him over the top, and that's why he won his narrow victory as the Chicago mayor. So all Brandon Johnson is doing is pandering to the people who got him into office. He's dancing with the same chick that he brought to the prom because that's really all that this guy can do, and he's burned a lot of his support by being so generous to the illegal aliens in the city of Chicago. He's essentially trying to re-up on them because Brandon Johnson is telling everybody that his piss-poor approval ratings will improve, don't worry about it, and the only thing he knows to do, because this is the only ground he thinks he can gain, is to pander to black people in the hopes that they will vote for him again. To me, it is not surprising at all that there are two key groups that ended up getting Brandon Johnson into office, and these two key groups are the ones that Brandon Johnson is constantly pandering to, constantly painting as heroes, when in reality they're anything but. It happens to be the black population in the most criminal neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, and of course the Chicago Teachers Union. Now, we covered all these different efforts that Brandon Johnson has tried to put into place in order to sneak a massive pay increase for the Teachers Union, which, by the way, he will benefit from because while he's mayor, he didn't resign from the Chicago Teachers Union. He actually just went on leave. And of course, black people who voted for him. So in reality, is Brandon Johnson this racist? Yes, 100%. He absolutely is. He is playing to racial differences in order to forward his political career. However, he's also very opportunistic. If his voting base happened to be wealthy white progressives, he would pander to them more than he panders to black people because, again, he is just trying to stay in office, trying to stay in power, and luckily for him, pandering to those wealthy white gilded progressives would likely be in similar ways to what he's doing right now, hiring a bunch of black people because those people are definitely afflicted by white guilt. But nobody should be surprised by this. Nobody should be shocked that the Department of Justice is looking into and will likely find that Brandon Johnson is doing racist hiring practices, because the whole point of his campaign is to do stuff like this. What I find to be absolutely embarrassing is Brandon Johnson lying to all of our faces and telling us in reality the blacks care more about everybody else than anyone else, when that just could not be further from the truth in terms of the numbers based on in-group preference. Now, I will also point out that Brandon Johnson has a little bit of a Freudian slip throughout some of these interviews where he says, oh, we're trying to help everyone, and black people is everyone.
Having people in my administration that will look out for the interest of everyone, and everyone means you have to look out for the interests of black folks.
And for Brandon Johnson, based on how he got into office, make no mistake about it, that is essentially true. Brandon Johnson's entire voting base is largely black people from the most criminal areas of Chicago that, by the way, got behind him because he ran a very racist political campaign. Now look, I want to know what you guys think about all this down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Brandon Johnson going full racist. Till next time.